This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, it's Saturday and that means it's time for another edition of the History of the Banned and Restricted list. Last time we looked at 2007, a year where only two cards, both of them blue, were affected, Gifts Ungiven and Flash. The former was making blue-based combo decks too good, and the latter was a result of Wizards deciding to remove power level errata from most cards that had received it over the years. In so doing, Flash became way too powerful. This time around, we're looking at both 2008 and 2009, where we're going to continue to see a similar theme. Most of the cards we'll talk about in this video were banned or restricted as a result of trying to weaken blue decks in most formats, and one card we'll talk about was also the result of power level errata. It made sense to do these 2 years together because only one card would be added to the list in 2009. Let's start with 2008, where the first announcement would come in June. In June of 2008, 5 cards were restricted in Vintage. One of these was Flash, which we talked about last time. Another card restricted with this announcement was Gush, a card we talked about when we looked at 2003. It was basically just too good at loading up your hand. The other 3 cards, though, Brainstorm, Merchant Scroll, and Ponder, had never been banned or restricted in any format before 2008. All 5 of these cards were blue, and the overarching goal with these restrictions in Vintage was to make it so blue decks weren't quite so good and consistent. Most of them, with the exception of Flash, help you draw cards one way or another. Let's look at Brainstorm first. Brainstorm was printed with the intention of being a fixed ancestral recall, and while it is certainly not as good as the recall, it's still way too good for only 1 mana. If combined with fetch lands, it was even better, because you could shuffle away cards you didn't need. While it isn't quite a tutor, Mike Turian, in his discussion about this banned and restricted announcement, notes that the main concern was that Brainstorm lets you see way too many cards too efficiently, helping you draw into the truly busted cards in Vintage, most of which are restricted. The only way to make it so blue decks didn't have such a massive advantage in this area was to restrict Brainstorm and the other cards on this list. Brainstorm remains restricted in Vintage today, but it is one of the format-defining cards of Legacy where it remains unbanned. Next, let's look at Merchant Scroll, which is just a straight-up tutor. Somehow or another, it managed to go unrestricted in Vintage all this time, which is surprising because, as we've seen, basically every other reasonably efficient tutor had been restricted in the format so that they could prevent people from undermining the restricted list by just tutoring up their restricted cards. Even if Merchant Scroll isn't tutoring up restricted cards, it made combo decks a bit too consistent. The reason it didn't get banned is probably because they felt like it was an ultra-specific tutor only capable of getting blue instants. But that includes cards like Ancestral Recall and High Tide, not to mention countless others. Merchant Scroll remains restricted in Vintage today, where it is still frequently played as a singleton copy. The last card from this announcement is Ponder. Ponder bears a striking similarity to Brainstorm in that it also lets you pay only a single mana to look at 3 cards in your library, which was deemed too good in a format with busted cards like Vintage. In 2011, it would also be banned in both Extended and Modern. So that's the announcement for June of 2008, maybe the most blue-focused banned and restricted announcement ever. The next announcement for the year came in September. This announcement banned Sensei's Divining Top in Extended, and Time Vault was banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage. Let's start with the top. Sensei's Divining Top might seem innocuous, but it quickly proved to be quite powerful, because it could make decks far more consistent. It could be combined with Counterbalance very effectively, and Trinket Mage had no problem searching it up. It could also be combined with fetch lands to really make your card selection that much more impressive. While these things were all factors in the card getting the axe in Extended, there was another reason the top was banned. It made games way too long. Since it was colorless, it was pretty much a staple for a while there, and players constantly activated the top, reordering cards, cracking fetch lands, shuffling, and doing it again, resulting in a very difficult to watch environment for the format, in addition to just making games take way too long. It remained legal in other formats for a while, but when Modern was created in 2011, the top was on the initial ban list, and it has remained there ever since. In 2017, it was also banned in Legacy because it was making a deck there far too good that relied on certain cards being on top of the library. This included cards with Miracle as well as Counterbalance. These days, it's only legal in Vintage. The other card affected by the September 2008 announcement was Time Vault. That's right, Time Vault. You may remember it from way back in 1994 when it got restricted because it was too easy to just keep untapping the thing to take extra turns over and over again. Well, since then it has had a rather interesting history. In 1996 it was unbanned and given power level errata. They had to find a way to keep the card from being abused by untap effects, and they came up with something interesting. They decided to make it so it needed to have something called a time counter on it for you to take the extra turn. It only gained this counter from you skipping a turn. This means that you always needed to have a counter to take an extra turn. This made Time Vault pretty bad, and no one played it for a while. The power level errata was a success. That is, until 2006, when people found a way to abuse this power level errata with Flame Fusillade in the Eternal formats. You could technically just keep skipping turns with the Vault and then untap it until you do enough damage to your opponent with the Fusillade. It doesn't matter that you're skipping a bunch of turns because now your opponent is dead. This resulted in a new power level errata that said you can only do it once per turn. After all these problems, in 2008, they removed the power level errata from Time Vault as part of their overarching plan of getting rid of all power level errata. With the functionality restored to its original state, the card was back to being a 2-card combo with untap effects, letting you take lots of extra turns. As a result, it was banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, and it remains that way today. Now, let's move to 2009, where we only had one card added to the banned and restricted list, which happened in June of that year. That card was Thirst for Knowledge, which was restricted in Vintage. That's right, it's another card that lets you see 3 cards in your deck that got restricted. In this case, it costs 3 mana, but it was always played in decks that could discard an artifact and get to hold on to 2 cards. In particular, Tezzeret control decks in Vintage had gotten super strong, and they wanted to do everything they could possibly do to make the deck worse. It seems kind of crazy, but because of all the restrictions in Vintage, at the time, Thirst for Knowledge was the best unrestricted card draw spell around, especially in an artifact-heavy deck like Tezzeret. They decided to restrict the Thirst so those decks would not be quite as good at assembling the various combos the deck was capable of, one of which included the newly restored Time Vault and taking infinite turns. That would be it for 2009, though. It was a very good year for Wizards, the second best they ever had, second to only 2002, a year that had no bans or restrictions, and overall, both 2008 and 2009 made restrictions and bannings that were in the best interest of the game. 2010 would not be quiet, though, and that's the year we'll take a look at next time. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need to catch up on the series, you can find the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.